Welcome to Motorcycle Restoration 101. This is a series of short videos that I hope will be of help to the newbie to motorcycle restoration, and maybe even offer a new way of approaching certain operations to you pros. My name is Lex. I'm president and owner of VintageMotorcycleTools.com, which, as its name implies, makes tools for classic or older bikes. Today I'd like to talk briefly on the subject of dismantling a frozen engine, by which I of course mean an engine locked up by rust or catastrophic component failure. Often, if this is done incorrectly, usable parts are damaged unnecessarily, and irreplaceable components can be lost forever. Now, we'd obviously like to avoid that, and I have a technique that has been of great value to me when attacking this problem. Normally, the first thing we do is pull the head off of a frozen engine, looking to see what the piston and cylinder look like inside. In the vast majority of engines that I've dealt with, this is the source of the lockup, especially in two-stroke engines. The reasons are myriad, but the outcome is the same. The normal disassembly routine involves removing the cylinder and then splitting the cases. Now, since the cylinder straddles the cases, locking them together, it's a very reasonable approach. But to get the cylinder off a frozen engine, most folks have to anoint the piston and walls with penetrating oil, let it set for a week or so, and then whack the piston with a piece of wood and a hammer. If it's still frozen, more oil is applied and the waiting process is repeated. Now, sadly, this can take a week or more in many cases and carries another liability. If there's something wrong on the bottom end of the engine, forcing the crank to rotate could cause irreparable damage to the cases, crank, and conrod. Now, here's another way. After removing the head, simply remove the cylinder studs. The cylinder now no longer locks the side cases together. It should be possible to separate them and remove the crank with the piston in situ, so to speak. This opens up a lot of different ways to remove the piston, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, I've used this method many times, and I've had excellent results. If this were all there was to it, I'd sign off now and wish you the very best. But there are some caveats. One of them I'm going to demonstrate with this Bultaco Alpina engine. This one's locked solidly, but there are a few degrees of rotation of the crank. That indicates that, as usual, the piston is the culprit, most likely. You can see that I've already removed the 4 cylinder studs. The 2 remaining ones do not actually go through the cylinder into the case, but are simply mounted in the cylinder itself to supply a bit more strength to the head gasket seal. I know because I checked. That's always a good idea. We'll get started by removing the clutch and internal flywheel. Now, unlike a lot of bikes, the Bull uses a pin and washer retainer for the clutch springs instead of tubular nuts or simple clutch screws. Now, this isn't a problem by any means, it's just a little different. These springs will need to be compressed so that the pin can be removed. The only problem is that with a conventional spring compressor, the clutch is rotated to put the next pin to be removed under the compressor tool. With a locked engine, you can't do that. So we designed our compressor to allow for fore and aft movement of the tool, as well as allowing the bit itself to be rotated to match the angle of the clutch spring pins. And it's pretty handy. We'll install the compressor at the rear of the engine in one of the case screw holes. A good solid finger tight is sufficient. And then we'll set the socket over the first pin to be removed and align that pin in the notch. Then we'll align with fore and aft movement the socket so that it's perpendicular to the pin. Now, you can use needle nose pliers or forceps to pull the pins out, but my favorite tool is a neodymium magnet and a pair of forceps. They're very strong magnets, but they make for instant pin removal, and there's no danger of dropping those tiny pins. Remove the springs and the washers, and you're ready to repeat for the rest of the pins. After removing the clutch plates, hub nut, and the flywheel nut, we're ready to pull the primary drive off the engine. I'll slide the clutch up until the chain binds, and then I'll slip the handle of a soft mallet underneath it to keep it this way. As I pull the flywheel, it'll release that binding, and hopefully it'll keep it from binding in the other direction until the part is completely off the crankshaft. I'll use a simple 2-jaw puller to remove the flywheel. Pretty much any appropriately sized 2 or even 3-jaw puller should work fine for a non-critical application like this. And we'll give it some cranks. And we're free. With the primary off, all we have to do is remember to save any keys that might be in the keyways and any spacers or gasket seal bushings. We'll remove the countershaft sprocket and all the case screws from both sides. Check carefully to be sure you've got them all, and especially check under the cylinder. I've taken the engine off the stand for the splitting operation and put it on this recycled car mat. Car mats work great for moving an engine around on the bench, as the carpet allows smooth movement, while the rubber backing behind it keeps any leftover oil off the bench. I'll install our universal case splitter or case closer tool. I'll do that in a couple of these screw holes for the crankshaft seal flange. And then I'll give the jack screw a few tentative turns. I'm finding it a little tighter than I think it should be. The cases are beginning to separate, but that resistance is worrying to me. Now, when splitting cases on most engines, it's good practice to wrap on the countershaft or other transmission shafts with a soft dead blow mallet to prevent binding on these shafts. When you do this, normally it'll release pressure on the crankshaft and you'll find the jack screw rotates easily again. But that's not really happening here. So I realize there's a problem and it has to be addressed. You can see as the engine turns, and you can see the back of it, that the cases are separating, but with careful inspection the problem's apparent. The cylinder is remaining fixed over the right side engine case. Normally it would be moving away to the left side. This means there's a locating pin that's keeping the cylinder fixed in place, and that's the caveat I was speaking of before. Now, not all manufacturers use locating pins under the cylinders, but it's not unusual. Check your manual, your drawings, and your disassembly instructions, but be prepared. Not all manuals mention locating pins or alignment dowels, as they're really not an issue when doing normal disassembly on non-frozen engines. We'll move the splitter tool back to the other side of the engine, and after a little initial resistance, the cases resume opening very nicely. As the transmission falls out, we're ready for the next step. If you look in the picture, you'll see that I've gently tapped that cylinder until it's raised up and cleared off of the alignment dowel. After doing that, I've reinstalled the splitter tool and I can press the crank and cylinder out of the right side engine case with no further fuss. And there we are. We didn't have to wait a couple of weeks to be able to disassemble this engine. And now we can use another method to get the piston free of the crank. I simply apply a little penetrating oil and about 20 tons of hydraulically generated pressure with a plate on top of the piston to protect it. Please excuse the shaky video. I was trying to film this by hand while cranking the press. And success. I hope you found this helpful. If you're interested in any of our tools that you've seen today, you can go to vintagemotorcycletools.com. The engine stand I used is my personal prototype of our Mark II stand, which is a very popular item. Now, my old stand has been more than strong enough for any engine I've used it on, but the Mark II has even greater strength because of extra gusseting, and it has a much improved rotating and head-locking mechanism. The Bultaco clutch press was also a prototype, but the production item is available on our website for any of you Bultaco enthusiasts. And please feel free to contact me at support@vintagemotorcycletools.com if you have any questions or comments. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Until the next clip, you have our best wishes for success on your restoration projects. Let us know if we can be of help.